There comes a moment in life when the noise of the world begins to fade. Not because the world becomes quieter, but because your heart begins to seek something different. For most of our lives, we are taught to keep moving, work harder, go farther, stay busy, chase success, attend every gathering, fill every empty space with activity. And for many years, that advice makes sense. When we are young, life is about building careers, building families, building dreams. But after 70, something remarkable begins to happen. Life starts teaching a different lesson. A lesson that many people don't understand until they experience it themselves. A lesson about peace. A lesson about slowing down. A lesson about home. This is the story of Margaret. Margaret was 74 years old. For decades, she had been known as the woman who was always busy. She attended every family gathering. She never missed a community event. She volunteered at church. She joined clubs. She traveled whenever she had the chance. Her calendar was always full. People admired her energy. They often said, "Margaret, I don't know how you do it." And she would laugh, because staying busy had become her identity. She believed that activity meant purpose. Movement meant happiness. Being needed meant being valuable. Then one autumn morning, something happened that changed everything. Margaret was driving home after attending 3 different events in 1 week. She felt exhausted, not the kind of tiredness that disappears after a good night's sleep. This was different. It felt deeper. As she pulled into her driveway, she sat in her car for several minutes. The engine was off. The neighborhood was quiet. Golden leaves drifted across the lawn. For the first time in many years, she simply sat there and listened. No phone ringing, no conversations, no schedule, no obligations, just silence. And in that silence, she realized something surprising. She felt more peaceful sitting alone in her driveway than she had felt during any of the activities she had attended all week. The realization shocked her, because she had spent years believing that happiness existed outside her home, at meetings, at parties, at events, at restaurants, at gatherings. Yet here she was, feeling something she hadn't felt in a very long time: calm. That evening, Margaret made a decision. A small decision. She decided not to attend an event scheduled for the following day. It wasn't because she was sick. It wasn't because she was upset. She simply wanted to stay home. The next day felt strange. For decades, she had trained herself to believe that staying home meant missing out. But as the morning unfolded, something unexpected happened. She enjoyed it. She woke up slowly. She drank coffee by the kitchen window. She watched birds visit the feeder in her backyard. She listened to music she hadn't heard in years. She opened a photo album. She smiled at memories. Hours passed. Yet she never once felt bored. In fact, she felt lighter than she had in months. That single day became the beginning of a transformation. Over the following weeks, Margaret started paying attention to how she felt after different activities. Whenever she rushed from place to place, she felt drained. Whenever she spent quiet time at home, she felt refreshed. The pattern became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, her daughter called. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked. "Of course," Margaret replied. "You've been staying home more lately?" Margaret smiled. "Yes. Are you lonely?" The question lingered in the air. For a moment, Margaret thought carefully before answering. "No," she finally said. "I'm peaceful." There is a big difference between loneliness and peace. Many people confuse the two, especially younger people. They often assume that older adults who spend more time at home must be sad, must be isolated, must be missing life. But that's not always true. Sometimes staying home isn't about withdrawing from life. Sometimes it's about finally connecting with life in a deeper way. After 70, many people discover something that younger generations often overlook. The world moves very fast. Too fast. And after decades of keeping up with that speed, the soul becomes tired, not broken, just tired. Home offers something the outside world often cannot provide. Home offers stillness. At home, there are fewer expectations, fewer comparisons, Fewer pressures, fewer performances. You don't have to impress anyone. You don't have to prove anything. You can simply exist, and that is a gift. Margaret began noticing details she had ignored for years. The way sunlight entered her living room every morning, the sound of rain against the windows, the scent of freshly baked bread, the comfort of her favorite chair, the beauty of an ordinary afternoon. These small moments had always been there. She simply hadn't slowed down enough to notice them. One winter evening, she sat beside the fireplace and reflected on her life. She thought about all the years she had spent chasing the next event, the next obligation, the next commitment, and she asked herself a question. What was I running toward? The answer surprised her. Most of the time, she hadn't been running toward anything. She had simply been running because she thought she was supposed to. Many older adults do the same thing. Society often sends a message that staying busy equals staying relevant, that slowing down means giving up, that resting means weakness. But wisdom teaches a different truth. Wisdom says that every season of life has its own purpose. The purpose of youth is often growth. The purpose of middle age is often responsibility. But the purpose of later life may be something entirely different. Reflection, gratitude, peace, presence. Margaret was finally learning how to embrace that season. And the more she embraced it, the happier she became. Friends occasionally questioned her new lifestyle. "Don't you get bored?" they asked. She would smile. No, because she had discovered something many people never learn. A peaceful home can become one of the richest places on earth, not because of what's inside the house, but because of what happens inside the heart. When life becomes quieter, you begin hearing things that were always there. Your memories, your gratitude, your wisdom, your faith, your inner voice, and perhaps most importantly, you begin hearing yourself. For decades, Margaret had listened to everyone else's expectations. Now she was finally listening to her own needs, and what she heard was simple. Slow down, rest, be present, enjoy what remains. One snowy afternoon, she looked out the window and smiled. Children were playing in the distance. Cars passed along the road. The world continued moving. But for the first time in many years, she didn't feel the need to chase it. She was content exactly where she was, at home, safe, comfortable, peaceful. And that is where our story truly begins. Because staying home after 70 isn't about hiding from life. It's about discovering a new way to live it. A way that values peace over pressure, meaning over motion, presence over business. A few weeks after Margaret began spending more time at home, something unusual happened. The constant feeling of exhaustion started to disappear. Not overnight, not in a dramatic way, but little by little. The tension she had carried for years seemed to loosen its grip. She slept better, she smiled more often. She felt calmer. At first, she couldn't explain why. After all, she wasn't doing anything special. She wasn't taking expensive vacations. She wasn't attending exciting events. She wasn't chasing new adventures. In fact, from the outside, her life looked simpler than ever. But inside, something beautiful was happening. For the first time in decades, her mind had room to breathe. Many people reach their 70s carrying invisible weight. The weight of responsibilities, the weight of memories, the weight of losses, the weight of worry. For years, they learn how to carry these burdens while staying busy. In fact, business often becomes a distraction, a way to avoid sitting alone with difficult thoughts, a way to avoid silence, a way to avoid reflection. But eventually, life slows down whether we want it to or not. And when it does, we are faced with an important choice. We can continue filling every moment with activity, or we can learn how to find peace within ourselves. Margaret didn't realize it at first, but her home had become a sanctuary, a place where her heart could finally rest. One rainy morning, she sat beside her living room window. A warm blanket rested across her lap. A cup of tea steamed gently beside her. Outside, the world seemed gray and busy. Cars rushed down wet streets. People hurried through the rain. Everyone appeared to be chasing something. Margaret watched quietly, and then she noticed something. For the first time in many years, she felt no desire to be out there, no desire to rush, no desire to compete, no desire to keep up. She simply enjoyed watching. There was peace in being still. There was peace in observing life rather than constantly trying to control it. This realization changed her, because for most of her life, she believed happiness required movement. She believed fulfillment came from doing more, achieving more, attending more. But now she was discovering a different truth. Sometimes happiness comes from less noise, less pressure, less obligation, less stress. The older we become, the more valuable peace becomes. When we are young, excitement often feels like the goal. We seek adventure, we seek stimulation, we seek constant activity. But after 70, many people begin craving something different, not because they have given up on life, but because they finally understand what truly matters. Peace is not boring. Peace is precious. And unfortunately, many people spend their entire lives searching for it in the wrong places. They look for it in success, in possessions, in achievements, in approval from others. Yet peace often waits quietly in the simplest places. A favorite chair, a quiet room, a familiar kitchen, a garden, a front porch, a home filled with memories. Margaret began appreciating these things more each day. One afternoon, she opened an old photo album. Inside were photographs spanning nearly 50 years. Pictures of birthdays, family vacations, Christmas mornings, school graduations, wedding celebrations, tiny moments frozen in time. As she turned the pages, tears filled her eyes. Not tears of sadness, tears of gratitude. She realized something profound. Many of the happiest moments of her life had happened at home, not at fancy events, not at crowded gatherings, not during expensive trips. At home, the place she had spent years overlooking, the place she once believed was ordinary. Now she understood. Home had quietly witnessed her entire story. Every joy, every challenge, every victory, every heartbreak. Its walls had protected her through decades of life. And now, in her later years, it was offering her something even more valuable. Comfort. There is a unique comfort that comes with familiar surroundings. You know where everything is. You know the sounds. You know the smells. You know the memories attached to every corner. This familiarity creates emotional security. And emotional security becomes increasingly important as we age. The world changes rapidly. Technology changes. Culture changes. News headlines change. Sometimes it can feel overwhelming. Home becomes an anchor, a place that reminds us who we are, a place where we don't have to adapt every minute, a place where we can simply be ourselves. Margaret began noticing how much energy she saved by staying home more often. She no longer worried about traffic. She no longer rushed to appointments. She no longer felt obligated to attend events she didn't truly enjoy. That extra energy began flowing into things that mattered more: reading, praying, reflecting, talking with loved ones, taking care of herself. One evening, her grandson came to visit. He was 22 years old, full of energy, full of ambition, full of plans. As they sat together, he asked her an interesting question. "Grandma, if you could go back and live your life again, what would you do differently?" Margaret smiled thoughtfully. She looked around her living room. Then she answered, "I would spend less time rushing." Her grandson seemed surprised. "Really?" She nodded. "Most of the things I worried about never mattered." The room became quiet. Then she continued, "I spent years thinking happiness was somewhere ahead of me." She paused. "But some of my happiest moments were right where I was." Those words stayed with her grandson long after the conversation ended, and perhaps they contain wisdom for all of us, because modern life constantly encourages movement, faster, more, bigger, busier. Yet wisdom often points in the opposite direction, toward simplicity, toward gratitude, toward stillness, toward home. As Margaret's 70s continued, she developed small daily rituals. Every morning she opened the curtains and watched the sunrise. Every afternoon she spent time reading. Every evening she reflected on the blessings of the day. These routines were simple, but they gave her life rhythm, purpose, meaning, and most importantly, peace. The truth is that peace rarely arrives as a dramatic event. It arrives quietly, like sunlight entering a room, like birds singing outside a window, like a warm cup of coffee on a cold morning, like a familiar chair waiting at the end of the day. Many older adults eventually discover that staying home is not about shrinking their world. It's about deepening their experience of it. When distractions fade, appreciation grows. When noise decreases, gratitude increases. When life slows down, beauty becomes easier to see. Margaret was learning this lesson every day, and the more she embraced it, the happier she became. The outside world continued moving at its usual pace, but inside her home, she found something far more valuable than constant activity. She found contentment, not excitement, not entertainment, not distraction. Contentment. That quiet feeling of knowing that this moment is enough, that this place is enough, that this life is enough. And for many people after 70, that discovery becomes one of the greatest gifts of all. Because true happiness is not always found by going somewhere new. Sometimes it is found by finally appreciating where you already are. As the months passed, Margaret noticed something she never expected. The fewer places she went, the closer she became to the people she loved. At first, it didn't make sense. For years, she had believed that being socially active meant having stronger relationships. She attended gatherings. She joined groups. She participated in events. She spent countless hours surrounded by people. Yet somehow, many of those interactions felt shallow. Pleasant but shallow. There were smiles. There were conversations. There were handshakes. But very little genuine connection. Now, as she spent more time at home, something different was happening. The relationships that truly mattered were becoming deeper. One afternoon, her daughter Emily stopped by unexpectedly. Margaret was sitting in her favorite chair, reading a novel. The house was quiet. The smell of freshly baked cookies filled the kitchen. Emily walked in carrying stress on her face. Margaret recognized it immediately. She remembered that look. The look of someone carrying too much responsibility. The look of someone trying to hold everything together. Emily sat down across from her mother and sighed. For several moments, neither woman spoke. The silence felt comfortable, safe. Then Emily finally said something. "Mom, can I ask you a question?" Margaret smiled. "Of course. How do you stay so calm?" The question surprised her. For most of her life, nobody had ever described her as calm. Busy. Yes, energetic. Absolutely. Reliable, without question. But calm? That was new. Margaret thought carefully before answering. Then she said something simple. "I stopped chasing everything." Emily stared at her. "What do you mean?" Margaret looked around the room. "I spent most of my life believing that I had to be everywhere." She smiled gently. "But now I understand that I only need to be where I matter." The words hung in the air, and Emily felt their truth immediately, because she was living the same life Margaret once lived, running, rushing, trying to keep everyone happy, trying to meet every expectation, trying to do it all. Like many people in modern society, Emily had become exhausted without realizing it. Margaret recognized the pattern because she had lived it herself. That afternoon, they talked for hours, not because they had something urgent to discuss, not because there was a problem to solve. They simply enjoyed each other's company. And as Emily drove home later that evening, she realized something. It had been years since she and her mother had spent that much uninterrupted time together. Years. The realization made her sad, but it also made her grateful. Because now they had the opportunity to reconnect. This became one of the unexpected gifts of Margaret's quieter lifestyle. She finally had time for meaningful conversations. Not rushed conversations. Not conversations squeezed between appointments. Not conversations interrupted by obligations. Real conversations. The kind that nourish the soul. The kind people remember. The kind that strengthen relationships. One evening, Margaret's grandson visited again. This time he brought dinner. As they sat together in the kitchen, he asked questions about her childhood. Questions he had never asked before. Questions he had never taken time to ask. Margaret told stories about growing up without smartphones, without computers, without social media. She described family dinners where everyone talked for hours, neighborhoods where people knew each other's names, summer evenings spent on front porches. Her grandson listened carefully, fascinated. For nearly 3 hours, neither of them touched a phone. Neither checked messages. Neither looked at a screen. They simply talked. And afterward, her grandson said something that touched her deeply. "Grandma, I think this was my favorite visit ever." Margaret smiled. It had been her favorite too. The truth is that meaningful relationships rarely require constant activity. They require presence, attention, time, and those things become easier to offer when life slows down. Many older adults discover this after 70. When they stop filling every empty space with busyness, they create room for deeper connections. Connections with family, connections with friends, connections with neighbors, and sometimes connections with themselves. Margaret began noticing another interesting change. The people who truly cared about her continued showing up. The people who genuinely valued her made time. The relationships built on love grew stronger. Meanwhile, some superficial relationships naturally faded. At first, that seemed sad. But eventually, she realized it was actually freeing, because quality matters more than quantity, especially later in life. A handful of meaningful relationships can bring more joy than hundreds of casual acquaintances. One Sunday afternoon, Margaret sat on her porch watching the sunset. A neighbor named Robert walked by. For years, they had exchanged brief greetings. Nothing more. Hello. Good morning. Nice weather today. The usual neighborhood conversations. But this day was different. Robert stopped. Margaret invited him to sit for a moment. That moment turned into 2 hours. During their conversation, Margaret learned that Robert had recently lost his wife. He admitted he often felt lonely. He admitted he missed having someone to talk to. Margaret listened. Really listened. Not because she had somewhere else to be. Not because she was trying to fix his problems. She listened because she cared. By the end of the evening, both felt lighter. Both felt understood. And a genuine friendship began. This became another lesson Margaret learned after 70. Home is not a prison. Home can become a place where meaningful relationships grow. People often assume staying home means isolation, but isolation isn't determined by location. It's determined by connection. You can feel lonely in a crowded room, and you can feel deeply connected while sitting quietly at home with someone you love. Margaret experienced this truth repeatedly. As her life became simpler, her relationships became richer. The conversations became deeper. The moments became more meaningful. The memories became more precious. One winter evening, she sat alone by the fireplace reflecting on the people who had shaped her life. Her parents, her husband, her children, her friends. Some were still living. Others had already passed away. As she thought about them, she realized something important. At the end of life, people rarely wish they had attended more meetings. They rarely wish they had spent more time rushing from place to place. They rarely wish they had stayed busier. Instead, they treasure relationships, conversations, shared meals, laughter, love, connection. Those are the things that endure. Those are the things that matter. And staying home more often had helped Margaret focus on exactly those things. The older she became, the more she appreciated this gift. Because after 70, time feels different. You become aware that each day matters. Each conversation matters. Each moment matters. And you begin choosing quality over quantity. Depth over distraction. Meaning over motion. Margaret was no longer interested in being everywhere. She was interested in being present. Present with the people she loved. Present in the moments she was given. Present in the life she had built. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all, because the richest life is not always the busiest one. Sometimes the richest life is the one filled with meaningful connections, quiet conversations, and people who truly care. One bright spring morning, Margaret woke before sunrise. The house was still. The neighborhood was silent. For a few moments, she simply lay in bed listening. The distant song of birds drifted through an open window. A gentle breeze moved the curtains. The world felt peaceful. Years ago, mornings like this would have looked very different. An alarm clock would have startled her awake. She would have rushed through breakfast, checked her calendar, reviewed her commitments, prepared for another busy day. There was always somewhere to go, always something to do, always another obligation waiting. But now, at 74, her mornings had become slower, softer, kinder, and she loved them. As she sat in her kitchen sipping coffee, she reflected on something she had recently realized. Her energy had become one of her most valuable possessions. Not money, not belongings, not achievements, energy. Because after 70, energy becomes precious. Every decision costs something. Every outing requires effort. Every commitment demands attention. And unlike younger years, energy is no longer unlimited. This isn't a weakness. It's simply a reality of aging, a reality many people resist. Margaret had resisted it too. For years, she tried to maintain the same pace she had kept in her 40s and 50s. She told herself she could still do everything. Go everywhere, attend every event, meet every expectation. But eventually, her body began sending messages. Messages she could no longer ignore. She felt tired more often. Recovery took longer. Stress affected her more deeply. Even enjoyable activities sometimes left her exhausted. At first, this frustrated her. Then one day, she made an important discovery. The goal wasn't to have more energy. The goal was to protect the energy she already had. That single realization changed everything. Instead of asking herself, "What can I fit into my schedule?" she began asking, "What deserves my energy?" The difference was profound, because not everything deserves access to your limited energy. Not every invitation, not every obligation, not every request, not every expectation. Especially after 70, one afternoon, Margaret received an invitation to attend a large social event. Years earlier, she would have accepted immediately, without hesitation, without thinking. But this time she paused. She imagined the drive, the crowds, the noise, the long hours, the exhaustion she would likely feel afterward. Then she asked herself a simple question. Do I truly want to go? The answer surprised her. No, not because she disliked the people, not because she was antisocial, but because her heart wanted something different. Her heart wanted peace. So she politely declined. And for the first time in her life, she did not feel guilty. That evening, she stayed home. She watched the sunset from her porch. She read a favorite book. She enjoyed a quiet dinner. And when she went to bed, she felt grateful. Not because she had done something exciting, but because she had honored her own needs. This became one of the greatest gifts of growing older. She stopped living according to everyone else's expectations and started living according to her own wisdom. Many older adults spend decades caring for others, raising children, supporting spouses, helping friends, serving communities, meeting responsibilities, giving and giving and giving. These acts are beautiful. They matter. But eventually, there comes a season when caring for yourself becomes equally important. Margaret was entering that season, and she was finally learning that self-care is not selfish. It is necessary. One afternoon, she visited her doctor for a routine appointment. After reviewing her health, the doctor smiled. "You seem less stressed." Margaret laughed. "I think I am." The doctor nodded. "Stress affects everything: sleep, blood pressure, energy, mood, even physical health." Margaret thought about those words for days afterward, because she realized how much unnecessary stress she had carried for years. Stress from rushing, stress from overcommitting, stress from trying to please everyone, stress from saying yes when she wanted to say no. Now, by spending more time at home, much of that stress had disappeared, and her body noticed, her mind noticed, Her spirit noticed. One evening, her friend Carol called. Carol sounded exhausted, overwhelmed, frustrated. As Margaret listened, she recognized something familiar. Carol was living the same busy lifestyle Margaret had once lived. Always rushing, always helping, always committing herself to more than she could comfortably manage. Finally, Carol asked, "How did you become so peaceful?" Margaret smiled. Then she answered honestly, "I stopped treating my energy like it was endless." Silence filled the phone line, because deep down, Carol understood exactly what she meant. Many people never realize how much energy they waste. They spend it on unnecessary worries. They spend it on obligations they don't enjoy. They spend it trying to satisfy impossible expectations. And before they know it, they have very little energy left for the things that truly matter. Margaret had learned to protect hers. She protected it by saying no when necessary. She protected it by simplifying her schedule. She protected it by staying home more often. She protected it by choosing peace over pressure. And the rewards were remarkable. Her days felt lighter. Her thoughts felt clearer. Her body felt stronger. Most importantly, she felt present. Because exhaustion steals presence. When we're tired, we miss things. We miss conversations. We miss beauty. We miss moments. We miss life itself. But when energy is protected, life becomes richer. Margaret noticed this every day. She noticed the changing seasons. She noticed small acts of kindness. She noticed laughter. She noticed gratitude. Things she might have overlooked during her busiest years. One afternoon, she sat beneath a tree in her backyard. The sunlight filtered through the leaves above her. A gentle wind moved across the grass. Nothing extraordinary was happening. No grand event, no major accomplishment, no exciting adventure. Yet she felt completely content. And suddenly, she understood something. For most of her life, she had believed happiness came from doing more. Now she realized happiness often comes from needing less. Less stress, less rushing, less pressure, less obligation, less noise. The older she became, the more valuable this lesson felt. Because time itself had become precious. She no longer wanted to waste it chasing things that didn't truly matter. She wanted to spend her days wisely. She wanted to protect her peace, protect her health, protect her energy, protect her joy. And staying home had become one of the best ways to do exactly that. As the sun slowly disappeared below the horizon that evening, Margaret smiled. The world would continue moving quickly. People would continue rushing. Schedules would remain full. Expectations would remain endless, but she no longer felt obligated to participate in that race. She had discovered something far more valuable, a slower life, a gentler life, a life where energy was protected rather than depleted. And in doing so, she had uncovered a level of happiness that many people spend decades searching for. One evening, as summer slowly gave way to autumn, Margaret sat alone on her front porch. The sky glowed with shades of orange and gold. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. Leaves drifted lazily across the yard. The neighborhood was quiet. Children who had once played in the streets were grown. Families had come and gone. The years had passed more quickly than she ever imagined. As she watched the sunset, Margaret found herself thinking about the journey of her life. 74 years. Thousands of mornings. Thousands of evenings, countless experiences, countless memories, moments of joy, moments of heartbreak, moments of triumph, moments of loss. All of it now stretched behind her like a long, winding road. And for the first time, she wasn't focused on what came next. She wasn't worried about tomorrow. She wasn't chasing another goal. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply present, fully present. And in that moment, she felt something she had spent most of her life searching for. She felt complete. Not because everything in life had gone perfectly. It hadn't. Like everyone else, Margaret had known pain. She had buried loved ones. She had experienced disappointment. She had made mistakes. She had faced struggles. There were chapters she wished she could rewrite. Decisions she wished she could revisit. Words she wished she had spoken differently. Yet somehow, none of those things controlled her anymore. Because with age had come a different kind of wisdom, the wisdom to accept, the wisdom to forgive, the wisdom to let go. Many people spend their younger years trying to become someone, building identities, building reputations, building success, building security. And there is nothing wrong with that. Those years have purpose. But eventually another season arrives, a season that asks a different question. Not, what can I become? But who am I really? Margaret had finally begun answering that question. And surprisingly, the answer had little to do with accomplishments. It had little to do with status, little to do with possessions, little to do with recognition. Instead, it centered around simpler things: kindness, gratitude, faith, love, presence. These were the things that remained when everything else faded. One afternoon, Margaret found an old journal hidden inside a closet. The pages were yellow with age. As she read through entries written decades earlier, she smiled. Some entries described dreams she had achieved. Others described worries that never came true. Many pages were filled with concerns that had once seemed enormous. Yet now, looking back, most of those fears appeared small, temporary, almost insignificant. The realization was powerful. She had spent so much time worrying about things that ultimately didn't matter. Things she could not control. Things that never happened. Things that disappeared with time. And she wondered how many people were doing the same thing right now. How many people were sacrificing today's peace because of tomorrow's uncertainty? How many people were missing life while trying to manage it? The thought stayed with her. Because one of the greatest gifts of growing older is perspective. Perspective changes everything. You begin seeing what truly matters and what doesn't. You begin recognizing that many of life's greatest treasures cannot be purchased. They cannot be earned. They cannot be collected. They can only be experienced. A meaningful conversation, a peaceful afternoon, a loving family, a grateful heart, a quiet home. These are treasures, real treasures. Yet many people overlook them because they seem ordinary. Margaret once overlooked them too, but not anymore. Now she understood. The ordinary moments had always been the extraordinary ones. One evening, her granddaughter came to visit. She was preparing to leave for college. Excitement and nervousness filled her face. As they sat together, she asked Margaret a question. "Grandma, what's the secret to being happy?" Margaret smiled softly. Of all the questions she had been asked throughout her life, this one felt the most important. She thought carefully before answering. Then she said, "Stop rushing through your life." Her granddaughter looked surprised. Margaret continued, "Most people think happiness is somewhere in the future." She pointed gently toward the horizon. They think they'll find it after the next achievement, the next promotion, the next milestone. Then she placed her hand over her heart. But happiness usually lives much closer than that. The young woman sat quietly, listening, learning, absorbing every word. Margaret wasn't sharing advice from a book. She wasn't repeating a motivational quote. She was sharing wisdom earned through decades of living, decades of learning, decades of mistakes, and decades of growth. As darkness settled outside, the conversation continued, and Margaret realized something beautiful. The wisdom she had gained wasn't only helping her. It was helping others. That is another hidden blessing of later life. Your experiences become gifts. Your lessons become guidance. Your story becomes a light for someone else's path. And perhaps that is one reason staying home becomes so meaningful after 70, because home creates space for reflection, space for understanding, space for wisdom. Without constant distractions, life begins revealing its deeper truths, truths that often go unnoticed during busier years. Margaret discovered many of those truths while sitting quietly in her home. She learned that peace is more valuable than popularity. She learned that presence is more important than productivity. She learned that gratitude creates more happiness than success ever could. She learned that slowing down is not giving up. It is waking up. Most importantly, she learned that home is not merely a building. Home is a feeling of safety, a feeling of belonging, a feeling of acceptance, a feeling of peace. And after decades of searching for fulfillment in the outside world, she had finally discovered it within. One crisp autumn morning, Margaret stood by her window watching the sunrise. Golden light filled the room. Birds sang outside. The world slowly awakened. And as she looked around her home, she smiled. Not because life was perfect, not because every problem had disappeared, but because she was exactly where she needed to be. For years she believed happiness was waiting somewhere else. Now she understood. Happiness had been here all along, in the quiet moments, in the simple moments, in the ordinary moments, at home. As the years continued passing, Margaret remained grateful for this discovery. Because staying home after 70 wasn't about hiding from life. It wasn't about withdrawing from the world. It wasn't about becoming less. It was about becoming more present, more grateful, more peaceful, more connected, more alive. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. The world will always tell you to keep moving, keep chasing, keep striving, keep searching. But sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is stop, sit quietly, look around, take a deep breath, and recognize the blessings already surrounding you. Because after 70, staying home may not mean you're missing life. It may mean you've finally learned how to truly live it. And in that quiet understanding lies a happiness deeper than excitement, stronger than achievement, and more lasting than success. A happiness that feels like coming home, not just to a house, but to yourself.